Here's what they don't tell you in history class. Everyone knows Henry VIII, the guy who went through wives like a tyrant with a grocery list. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. That little rhyme we all learned. Catherine of Aragon, discarded. Anne Boleyn, executed. Jane Seymour, dead in childbirth. Anne of Cleves, divorced before the ink dried. Catherine Howard, beheaded for alleged adultery. But the sixth wife, Catherine Parr, the one who survived? That's the lie they sold you. Because survival implies she was passive, that she just outlasted him, that she got lucky, that Henry died before he could get around to killing her too. But here's the truth they buried in the footnotes, the stuff that doesn't make it into the costume dramas. Henry VIII, the man who broke from Rome, who executed chancellors and bishops, who dissolved monasteries and seized their wealth, who had 2 wives beheaded on trumped-up charges. This man spent the final years of his life absolutely terrified of his last wife. Not angry, not suspicious, terrified. Let me paint you the picture they don't show in the movies. It's 1545. Henry is 54 years old, which in Tudor England might as well be 80. His leg ulcer, a jousting wound that never healed, has turned gangrenous. The smell is so bad that servants draw straws over who has to dress it. He weighs close to 400 pounds. He can't walk without mechanical assistance. He's carried from room to room by a team of men using a specially designed chair. His mood swings are legendary. One minute he's sobbing, the next he's screaming for someone's execution. He's paranoid, deeply, clinically paranoid. And then there's Catherine Parr. She's 31 years old. She's been married twice before. Both husbands died. She's educated, which in itself was dangerous. She reads theology. She writes religious pamphlets. She has opinions about church reform. She corresponds with scholars across Europe. She's not some terrified teenager like Catherine Howard was. She's not desperate for validation like Anne Boleyn was. She's intelligent, composed, and she has access to his food, his medicine, and his bedchamber. And Henry knows it. There's a document, buried in the British archives, not widely discussed, where Henry's doctor records the king's sleep patterns in the final 2 years of his life. The king barely slept. When he did, he woke constantly, calling for guards, demanding to know who was in the hallways. He refused to eat or drink anything Catherine personally handed him. He had a servant taste everything first, even water. Why? Because Henry wasn't stupid. Paranoid, yes. Delusional about many things, absolutely. But not stupid. He knew exactly what he'd done to his previous wives, and he knew that Catherine Parr was smarter than all of them combined. Let me give you context. In 1546, just 1 year before Henry's death, Catherine Parr nearly got arrested. There was a warrant. It had Henry's signature on it. The charge? Heresy. She'd been having religious debates, Protestant-leaning discussions with scholars and courtiers. Someone informed on her. Henry signed off on her arrest. She found out about the warrant before it could be executed. And here's where it gets interesting. She didn't run. She didn't beg. She went directly to Henry's chambers and played the most dangerous game of chess in Tudor history. She walked in and said, and this is recorded by witnesses, she said she had only been debating theology to distract him from his pain, that she was just a simple woman trying to learn from her husband's infinite wisdom, that she deferred to his judgment in all things. Henry bought it. He tore up the warrant. He called her his sweetheart. When the guards showed up the next day to arrest her, Henry screamed at them, called them traitors for daring to touch his beloved wife. But here's what the history books skip over. Catherine Parr knew exactly what she was doing. She outmaneuvered him. She played the submissive wife just long enough to survive the moment, and then she went right back to her reformist activities. Quietly, carefully. And Henry knew. On some level, he absolutely knew. That's when the insomnia started. Imagine being Henry. You've executed 2 wives. You've had absolute power for decades. You've crushed rebellions, destroyed religious institutions, and bent the entire country to your will. But now you're old, you're sick, you're immobile, you're in constant pain. And the woman who sleeps in the same palace, who oversees your medical care, who has your complete trust publicly. You know she's smarter than you. You know she outplayed you once already. What if she does it again? What if that medicine she's preparing isn't medicine? The doctors recorded that Henry started obsessively asking about poisons, how they worked, what the symptoms were, whether they could be detected. He had servants bring him books on toxicology. He made his physician describe in detail what arsenic poisoning looked like versus nightshade versus hemlock. He was studying, preparing, waiting for the symptoms. And Catherine, she played it perfectly. She was the dutiful wife. She nursed him. She read to him. She managed the household. She was kind to his children, Mary, Elizabeth, Edward. She never gave him a reason to accuse her, but she also never gave up her intellectual pursuits. She published a book, Prayers or Meditations, in 1545, while married to Henry. It was a religious text with reformist undertones. She put her name on it. She didn't ask permission. That's not the behavior of a woman who's afraid. That's the behavior of a woman who knows exactly how much leverage she has. And Henry felt it. Every single day. There's an account from one of Henry's gentlemen of the bedchamber, a guy whose job was literally just to sleep on a cot outside the king's room. He wrote that Henry would wake up multiple times per night, whispering Catherine's name, asking if she was still in her chambers, asking if anyone had seen her walking the halls. He wasn't asking out of love. He was asking because he needed to know where she was, what she was doing, whether she was coming for him. You have to understand the psychology here. Henry had created a system where wives were disposable, where he could invent charges, fabricate evidence, and have them executed within weeks. He'd done it twice. He could do it again. But Catherine Parr had already survived 1 arrest warrant. She'd already proven she could outthink him. And now, he was weak. If he moved against her again and failed, if she exposed his paranoia, if she turned his children against him, if she revealed how sick and helpless he really was, he'd lose everything. So he didn't move. He just waited and feared. Let's talk about what Catherine actually had on him. Because this wasn't just paranoid delusion. Henry had genuine reasons to be afraid. First, she controlled access. As his wife and primary caregiver, Catherine decided who saw the king and when. She filtered his correspondence. She managed his schedule. If Henry wanted to issue an order, it went through her household first. If he wanted to see his children, she arranged it. If he wanted to meet with his counsel, she determined whether he was well enough to receive them. Think about that power dynamic. The man who'd spent his entire reign controlling every aspect of English life was now dependent on his wife to control every aspect of his daily existence. Second, she had allies, real ones. Catherine wasn't isolated like Anne Boleyn had been. She'd built relationships with reformist clergy, with scholars, with members of parliament. She corresponded with Protestant leaders across Europe. She had her own network, her own political base. If Henry moved against her, she could call in favors. She could create a scandal that would make his final years a public humiliation. Third, she had the children. Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward all loved her. She was the closest thing to a stable mother figure any of them had ever known. She tutored them. She protected them from Henry's rages. If Henry executed Catherine, he'd alienate all three of his heirs. The succession was already fragile. Edward was sickly. Mary was Catholic in an increasingly Protestant England. Elizabeth was illegitimate by Henry's own decree. He couldn't afford to lose their loyalty. And Catherine knew all of this. She knew exactly how untouchable she'd made herself. But Henry also knew something else. Something darker. Catherine Parr's previous two husbands had both died under somewhat mysterious circumstances. Not scandalous enough to be investigated, but convenient. Her second husband, John Neville, died in 1543, just months before Henry proposed to Catherine. The official cause was illness, but Neville had been in robust health. He died suddenly in his own home, with Catherine present. Her first husband, Edward Burrough, died in 1533, also suddenly. Also while Catherine was present. Now, were these deaths suspicious? Probably not. Men died all the time in the 16th century. Medicine was primitive. Infections killed. Accidents happened. But Henry was a man who saw conspiracies everywhere. And he was married to a woman who'd already buried two husbands and stood to inherit their estates. A woman who now had access to his food, his drink, and his medicine cabinet. You see where his mind went. There's a record from 1546, a private letter from one of Henry's physicians to a colleague, where he mentions that the king had started requesting that all his medications be prepared in front of witnesses, not just tasted, but actually mixed and measured while multiple people watched. The physician notes that this was unusual and troubling behavior, and that the king seemed particularly concerned about who held the keys to the medicine chest. Catherine held those keys. Let me tell you about the nights, because this is where it gets really dark. Henry's bedchamber in his final years was essentially a fortress. There were guards outside the door. There were servants sleeping in the adjacent room. There was a bell he could ring if he needed assistance. But despite all these precautions, Henry couldn't sleep. The gentleman of the bedchamber, the one I mentioned earlier, kept detailed logs. He had to record every time the king woke up, every time he called for something, every unusual occurrence. These logs still exist, and they paint a picture of a man in absolute psychological torment. On a typical night, Henry would wake 4 or 5 times. Sometimes he'd demand to see the guards, make them identify themselves, confirm they were who they said they were. Sometimes he'd send servants to check on Catherine, make sure she was in her chambers and not wandering. Other times, he'd just lie there, staring at the ceiling, listening. One entry from March 1546 describes Henry waking at 3 in the morning and demanding that a servant bring him the wine he'd been drinking earlier that evening. Not fresh wine, the same wine, from the same jug. He wanted to verify it was still safe. The servant noted that the king smelled it, held it up to the candlelight, examined it for sediment, and then didn't drink it. He just set it aside and asked for water instead. Sealed water. From a source he'd personally approved. This wasn't the behavior of a king. This was the behavior of a prisoner who knew his jailer was smarter than him. And the worst part? Catherine never had to do anything. She never had to threaten him. She never had to make a move. She just had to exist. She just had to be competent, intelligent, and present. And Henry's own paranoia did the rest. Let's talk about the financial angle, because this is where Catherine's brilliance really shows. When Henry married Catherine, she negotiated her jointure. Basically, the property and income she'd receive if Henry died. This was standard practice. But Catherine's jointure was unprecedented. She negotiated for lands worth over £4,000 a year. She negotiated for properties across England. She negotiated for the right to maintain her own household independently of the crown after Henry's death. In other words, she made sure she'd be wealthy and independent the moment Henry died. Now, most queens didn't think this way. Most queens were either too young, too politically naive, or too in love to think about life after the king. But Catherine had been a widow twice. She knew how this worked. She knew the game. And Henry signed off on it. Because in 1543, when they married, he was still healthy enough to believe he'd live another decade. He thought he had time. By 1546, though, when he realized he was dying, he also realized what he'd done. He'd given his smartest, most capable wife the resources to outlive him comfortably. He'd essentially funded her post-Henry life, and he couldn't take it back. The contracts were signed. The lands were transferred. If he tried to reverse it, it would look like paranoia. It would look like weakness. It would confirm what everyone already suspected, that he'd lost control. So he just lived with it. Lived with the knowledge that Catherine was counting down the days, planning her future, and there was nothing he could do about it. There's a moment in December 1546, just a month before Henry died, that perfectly encapsulates their relationship. Henry was bedridden. His ulcer had gotten so bad that he couldn't be moved without screaming in pain. Catherine came to his chamber to read to him, something she did regularly, because it was expected of a dutiful wife. She brought a book, a religious text, one of her own choosing, and she started reading. And the text was reformist, subtly Protestant, not heretical enough to be dangerous, but definitely pushing the boundaries of what Henry's Catholic-leaning court would approve. Henry listened for a while. Then he interrupted her. He asked her, and this is recorded by a servant who was present, he asked her, "Do you choose these passages to mock me? To remind me that you see further than I do?" Catherine smiled. She closed the book, and she said, "No, my lord. I choose them to comfort you. I thought you'd appreciate the clarity." Clarity. That was her word. Clarity. As if Henry's theological confusion, his flip-flopping between Catholic and Protestant policies, his entire religious legacy was just a lack of clarity. As if she had clarity, and he didn't. And Henry? He didn't say anything. He just stared at her. And then he waved her away, told her he was tired. But the servant noted that Henry didn't sleep that night. He just lay there, in the dark, staring at nothing. Because that's what Catherine did to him. She didn't need to threaten. She didn't need to poison him. She just needed to remind him constantly that she was smarter, that she saw through him, that she was waiting. Now let's talk about what happened after Henry died. January 28, 1547. Henry VIII is dead. Catherine Parr is officially a widow for the third time. She's 34 years old. She's wealthy. She's independent. She's free. 4 months later, 4 months, she marries Thomas Seymour. Thomas Seymour, the man she'd been in love with before Henry forced her into marriage. The man she'd had to give up because you don't say no to the king. 4 months. That's not mourning. That's not grieving. That's not the behavior of a woman who loved her late husband. That's the behavior of a woman who'd been waiting for him to die so she could finally live her life. And here's the kicker. Catherine had been corresponding with Thomas Seymour throughout her marriage to Henry. Secretly, carefully, but regularly. There are letters. They're coded, diplomatic, but anyone reading between the lines can see what's happening. She was maintaining the relationship, keeping it alive, planning for the future. While Henry was lying in bed, terrified that she was going to poison him, she was writing love letters to another man. The historical irony is almost poetic. Henry spent his entire life using women as pawns. He divorced, discarded, and executed them based on his needs. He treated them as means to an end. Political alliances, male heirs, personal satisfaction. And in the end, the woman who beat him, she did it by treating him the same way. She used him. She played the role of dutiful wife just long enough to secure her future. And then she walked away the moment he was dead. She didn't have to kill him. She just had to outlast him. And she did. But here's the question that keeps historians up at night. Could she have killed him if she wanted to? Absolutely. Catherine Parr had knowledge of medicine and herbs. She supervised his care. She prepared his food. She had access to apothecaries who could provide anything she needed. And she had motive, freedom, wealth, the man she actually loved waiting for her. But she didn't need to, because Henry's body was already killing him. The ulcer, the obesity, the infections. His own paranoia was probably doing more damage than any poison could. But the fact that she could have? That's what haunted Henry. That's what kept him awake. Because he'd spent his entire reign being the hunter. And in his final years, he realized he'd become the prey. And the predator wasn't some foreign army. It wasn't political rivals. It wasn't even God's judgment. It was his wife. The woman who smiled at him every morning, who read to him at night, who held his hand when the pain was unbearable. The woman he'd forced into marriage. The woman who was smarter than him. The woman who was waiting. That's the real story of Catherine Parr. Not that she survived, but that she won. She outthought him. She outmaneuvered him. She made the most powerful man in England spend his final days afraid of her. And when he finally died, she didn't even pretend to be sad. She moved on, immediately, without hesitation. Because Catherine Parr understood something that Henry never did. Real power isn't about violence. It's not about executions or fear or control. Real power is making someone afraid of what you might do, without ever having to do it. Henry VIII conquered England, but Catherine Parr conquered Henry, and she didn't need an army to do it.